In 2018, Unknown Worlds Entertainment completed the full release of their long-time developing game, Subnautica, an open-world underwater survival game. This game took the traditional survival experience and flipped it on its head, and had players living beneath the waves for 90% of their playtime. With many people saying the game was a sweet exploration game, and others suggesting it had the tone of a horror game, Subnautica established itself as one of those games you had to play to understand, and before you watch this video, I suggest anyone who has not yet played it to do so. With that being said, let's begin with the topic of this video, which is, why is Subnautica's soundtrack so atmospheric for the players? Starting from the very first moments of the game, you have a cutscene where you deploy in a life pod from an exploding ship and are knocked out by flying shrapnel only to wake up to the whole vessel being on fire. At this point, Chylinski, the composer of the Subnautica soundtrack, opens the taps and builds the atmosphere with the sound of steady electronic bass drum hits. This instantly sets the tone for the first three kinds of soundtrack you're about to experience, as Chylinski uses a lot of electronic music ideas during this soundtrack, most prominently when it comes to the high energy sequences, as it helps to set the tone for a futuristic and high energy survival experience, which I'll talk more about later. Once the fire is out and the danger has been averted, the player is then allowed to explore, and for the first dive into the world below, the music is cut completely, which gives us the second part of the soundtrack, the silences. This is key in a game like Subnautica, because the ocean is a silent place, and therefore in moments of exploration, often having no music creates complete immersion in the world, as there are no distractions apart from the sounds created by the life in the world around you. This is important, as Subnautica is more about the world than it is the story, as you're meant to forge your own path, and therefore without any musical cues or feelings produced by having creepy music or upbeat music, the player isn't influenced in any way as to how they approach the game. As well as this, in moments where you are unsure or feel tense, a silence can emulate that, as we are used to having sound cues, so when we don't, this can add to the tension, as we expect a jump scare from silence the same way we would in a horror movie. Then, for the third and final ingredient to the bass soundtrack, we have the atmospheric synth section. This is the part of the soundtrack that plays the most and mostly includes long atmospheric synth notes, such as wave samples and breathy strings. This is crucial to the Subnautica world, as this kind of sound creates a subtle but important atmosphere, as long stretching notes accompanied by the foley of creaking ships, or blowing wind, or even distant moving fish, makes the player feel like they are in the world without realising it. This is because atmospheric synths are ambiguous and don't have a melody, and so when we hear them they become part of the background rather than being noticeable like a melody would be, and this means that for Subnautica, when you hear these pieces of music, you almost hate them as the sounds of the world itself, especially when it comes to the wave and wind samples that you expect from being underwater. This helps to immerse the player, and depending on the biome you're in, can set different tones and make the player feel different things, such as quite peaceful and euphoric, with stacked synth chords in the surf shallows, adventurous and intrigued with long wave samples, and underlying high-pitched synths in the grassy plateau, and finally, more tense atmospheres with distant and extremely low or high-pitched samples that are warped to make uncomfortable sounds for the human ear in the crash site. This really brings each part of the world to life, as players are introduced to many biomes, each with their own underlying musical idea, yet these atmospheric synths make it so that as players, we hardly notice the music is making us feel certain emotions in different biomes, as it is subtle and only used sparingly. So, with all that being said, what in particular makes the Subnautica soundtrack fill out the atmosphere so well? To answer this question, we need to look at a few tracks in particular, starting with Subnautica's opening piece, Salutations. Opening with two synths playing side by side, Salutations instantly begins to set the tone with one low D bass frequency that reverberates but mostly holds the same note, whilst a higher vocal synth climbs through the pitches using D minor and climbing through the octaves using the notes D, E, F and G. This instantly sets a minor tone for the world, however this isn't a dark or creepy minor, this is more of an unknown and uncomfortable minor sound, which is exactly what Subnautica needs, as it creates the idea of a world that could lead to anything, and we just don't know what that is yet. This then climaxes with a high-pitched D, F, G run on the high synth, before the synths cut out and we were introduced to a half electronic music, half Foley sound, which is created by having samples of creaking or waves and creature sounds, which are then used to make an electronic music beat. This is the beat you'll hear throughout the track, and it sets the scene beautifully, as the music doesn't just add to the atmosphere, but instead it's created from samples of the atmosphere, which greatly helps to make you feel like you are living inside a breathing world. Then, over the top of this, the iconic melody of Subnautica plays on a high synth using the notes D, C, B, C and G in a descending order, except for the second C. This melody played on a high synth creates the perfect blend between the technological future of Subnautica and the explorative nature of the game, as the high synth creates the effect that it's a futuristic world, yet the simplicity of the melody and the undertone of the Foley beat underneath it creates the sense that there is more to know, and it is at this point that the melody starts to create a bit of a wonder feel, which is what makes the player want to explore more and see more of what the world has to offer. This then leads to the track looping back on itself and starting the original rising of pitches that the vocal synth did earlier, but this time with the Foley beat underneath it to add a bit of originality and difference to the sound. Once again, these climaxes of the high synth doing the D, F, G run, and this time the drop leads into that iconic melody with a real electronic drum kit beat underneath, mixed in with that Foley beat we are now used to. This creates the atmosphere that I think sums up Subnautica the best, as there is a high pace and energy from the drum kit, the world around it in the Foley sounds, the main melodic idea playing into the idea of exploration, and then finally synths underneath that fill out the sound and complete the music that makes it feel like it is an underwater world, as high vocal synths subconsciously remind us of mermaid-like sounds, and low reverberated synths are what most of us expect the deepest depths to sound like, and this creates the idea that you are entering the underwater world. The next track I want to talk to you about, for a very different kind of atmosphere, is Crash Site. This is the music you hear when you are closest to the aurora and surrounded by a thick fog that obscures your view, and although you cannot see them, you can hear the roars of the most deadly creatures known as the Reaper Leviathans. As you can tell just from that description, the music here is not bound to be as high energy and welcoming for our exploration as Salutations was, as the threat here is much higher and the music needs to reflect that. Opening with lots of chromatic notes played together on a synth, Crash Site instantly establishes that classic horror feel, but in Subnautica's own style, as rather than using the stabby chromatic sound of the most classic horror, Chylinski offers a more drawn-out, reverberated synth to keep that tradition of that more oceanic sound. Chylinski then takes the track in a variety of directions, seemingly one after the other to keep players on edge, as humans love a constant, and so if new things keep happening, it's an easy way to make us uncomfortable, and this is done by having a variety of synths from different pitches and samples come one after the other. This includes the vocal sound of angelic singing over the top of a sub-bass, which creates an uneasy harmony, followed up by non-musical samples that create the sound similar to that of a plane engine that is constant and doesn't seem to have a start or ending point, as it fades in and out so smoothly. Then, once again, we return to that angelic singing, but behind it now is an action-style beat, which makes us as the listener conflicted between the imminent danger of the beat below, which reflects that of shooters during an action sequence, and then singing above that comes with an air of calm and sadness. This once again helps us to put us more on edge, as the music conflicts against itself, and this helps to keep us as the player conflicted on whether we are safe or not. As well as this, in folklore, siren song is often related to the drowning of sailors, and therefore the action sounds beneath it creates a very real connection for the player that they are not in a safe space, and this creates a very unsure and often terrifying atmosphere when mixed with the distant roars of leviathans. This is often the reason that people will say that Subnautica is a horror title, as the music makes you very uneasy without you really being aware of what you're listening to, and this is often worse than actually being eaten by the leviathans, as the fear factor before it happens is what gets to you, and this is thanks to the expertly crafted and subtle music that keeps the players on edge throughout the most intense sections of the game. The final piece I want to touch on before I finish is perhaps many people's favourite track in Subnautica, Abandoned Ship. Whilst most of the Subnautica soundtrack does what Crash Site or Salutations does, and sets the mood of the location using different synths and samples, or creates the atmosphere using the actual game sounds themselves, Abandoned Ship is one of the exceptions that uses electronic music to create atmosphere for the player. This is because Abandoned Ship is essentially a club-type tune but in the style of Subnautica, meaning that it has a lot of weird synth sounds for its lead and surrounding music, but it still has the energy and feel of a night out in a club. Now, if you're wondering how this is appropriate for the atmosphere of Subnautica, the reason is because at the start of the video I mentioned that Subnautica is more about forging your own path and creating your own experience within the world, so that it is very different every time, and Abandoned Ship is one of the tracks that comes on when you've just succeeded at something or are on a trip back towards the life pod after a run out for whatever it is you were getting. This means that whenever this track comes on, it is helping to keep the energy and excitement alive for the player, as just after they have finished their task, they may have a fair distance to cover, and this can be a grueling task if the atmosphere created by the music is not high in energy and interesting, as sometimes a break from the underwater reverberations and unnerving silences for a high-octane club track is just what the player needs to revitalise their spirits in this lonely world. Some people argue that this takes away from Subnautica's atmospheric appeal. However, in my opinion, Abandoned Ship is the perfect music to build that sense of achievement that we all would get if we had started to build our shelter or found the missing piece we needed for our next puzzle, as atmosphere is not just about how the world feels, but also how we feel as the player. This is why so many people rate this track so highly, as whilst yes, it is a fun track, it is actually very simple, only using the notes D, E, F, A and C in a simple and repetitive pattern, but because we hear the track after we have achieved something, it makes us connect the feeling with the music, and that is what makes it so special to people. Overall, this is very different to the other two tracks I've spoken about. However, in my opinion, to build a good atmosphere, you need music that is more personal, rather than just music for the world around you, and that's why I think that using all the different techniques, from silences to reverberated synths to siren song, and even club music, Subnautica's soundtrack is an atmospheric masterpiece. So as you can see, I'm a big fan of this soundtrack. However, I think it is important to work out exactly what to take away from Chylinski's work when you are building worlds using music. Firstly, I think the idea of using samples from the world itself in your music is a brilliant idea and is a great way of bringing the world to you, as when I am playing Subnautica I always feel like I am living in the biome I am in due to the presence of the music samples and the creature sounds I can hear adding to the rhythm. Pairing this with the fact that morphed or twisted creature samples create interesting and creepy new ideas means that when I am listening to the Subnautica music, I am always being cautious of my surroundings, as the way that the music subconsciously affects us means that it gives the player the feeling of someone who is always under threat, which further heightens that survival experience. As well as this, I think Chylinski's use of synths should not be forgotten for world building music, as I think the ambiguity of long stretching synths is a great way of creating atmosphere without creating distractions. This works extremely well in Subnautica, as there are not many distinct melodies, and instead of listening to melodies, we listen to the sounds of the underwater world, with background atmospheric synths to fill out the empty space, and I think this is key for if you want to create an atmosphere where the players experience the world and not just playing through it. For me, these two techniques are really what makes Subnautica so special, especially in the atmosphere and tension it creates, as Chylinski has mastered the settings of each biome using these techniques, and that is why, as I said, this soundtrack is a masterpiece and one of the many things that makes Subnautica great. Thanks for watching, and let me know down below what games you'd like to see next. Goodbye.